During the weekly ratings conflict between WCW and WWF, dubbed the Monday Night Wars, real-life conflict proved to be just as enjoyable as the on-screen melodrama. In fact, oftentimes more so. With the battle lines drawn between the two entities, scripted angst couldn't hold a candle to the latest installment of some big star crossing over to the competition. And when four of the most gifted young in-ring performers of the modern era simultaneously made their way from Atlanta to New York at the turn of the millennium, it was safe to say that eyebrows were raised. Before we get to the finished product of Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Perry Saturn and Chris Benoit all showing up at a Pittsburgh Raw on January 31st, 2000, let's backtrack a bit and explain the allure of the quartet. Previously, all four men had, during the course of the Monday Night Wars, represented World Championship Wrestling. Saturn joined the promotion in the summer of 1997, while the other three arrived 2 years prior. They each also previously wrestled for ECW, all enjoying some form of championship glory during their time with that company. Benoit was briefly a tag champion with Malenko, while Saturn dominated the tag scene in 1996 and the first half of 97 with partner John Cronus, together known as the Eliminators. Among the aforementioned names, the most memorable chapter of ECW lore proved to be the series of matches pitting Malenko against Guerrero over the television title in 1995. Though on the whole, ECW earned a reputation for glorifying sex, violence and profanity in a manner that defied all prior wrestling convention, the company was also a sanctuary for brilliant athletes, allowing them to showcase their skills without restriction. Seeing Malenko and Guerrero thread together virtuoso performances mesmerized the same blue-collar fans that roared for bloodshed in the other matches. In today's American wrestling scene, respectful applause for standoffs following an intricate series of reversals is commonplace. In 1995, however, that idea seemed like it was practically invented for Malenko vs. Guerrero, as they engrossed arena goers and tape traders through their influential, game-changing performances. Among those who knew they were witnessing something special in these kinds of matches was WCW Vice President Eric Bischoff. In the summer of '95, Bischoff, on the cusp of launching Monday Nitro in direct competition with WWF's Raw, signed Benoit, Malenko and Guerrero. When Guerrero met with Bischoff shortly after coming on board, his new boss explained that the junior heavyweight marvels were going to be the car crashers in the middle of his movie, suggesting that they were there to captivate with their unparalleled athletics, while the big personalities like Hulk Hogan, Sting and others occupied the headline stories. Guerrero even admits that just getting the chance to make good money in WCW with a wife and 2 daughters at home was too good to pass up, regardless of where he was positioned on the card. WCW for the next several years ran from a rather inflexible playbook, aging superstar heavyweights on top, with the dynamic cruiserweights like Guerrero scattered in the lower 2/3 of the show, satiating the work rate crowd and impressionable youths in thrilling battles. Soon, WCW's secondary title scene was the envy of the business, as Chris Jericho, Rey Mysterio, Psychosis and Juventud Guerrera all followed in Benoit, Malenko and Guerrero's footsteps, graduating from ECW to the national stage. They matched up with their predecessors on many undercards over the years coming, churning out matches that ensured WCW pay-per-views received no worse than a thumbs in the middle from the more strident and discriminating critics. As in, yeah, Hogan vs. Piper sucked, but that Guerrero Mysterio match was really something else. Bischoff's events had the fieriest and most awing car crashes imaginable, essentially making him the Michael Bay of professional wrestling for a small time. While it's true that the cruiserweights weren't given a whole lot in the way of storyline consideration, the best of the bunch had reserved seats on the biggest events. They just couldn't quite get into the first few rows, that's all. The WCW smorgasbord of NWO coolness, main event level matches on TV, shocking swerves, and vivid in-ring wrestling made it the sleekest, most engrossing wrestling product on the American scene. That was until Stone Cold Steve Austin began regularly pummeling an insidious Vince McMahon on the other channel, causing the WWF to not only narrow the gap in the long one-sided Monday Night Wars, but finally notch a victory on the night of Monday, April 13th, 1998. WWF's resurgence was led by Austin, who just 3 years earlier had been fired from WCW by Eric Bischoff, and he wasn't the only ex-WCW talent at the front of the Attitude Brigade. Mick Foley, Triple H, The Undertaker, Sean Waltman, Road Dogg, Dustin Rhodes, and Farouk were all prominently visible on WWF programming. You can even count Jim Ross, who headed up talent relations for WWF and possessed a keen eye for talent. It wasn't just disgruntled escapees from the Turner Asylum either. The WWF's upper card contained plenty of internal projects, from the ascending Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, to Kane, to Sable, to Chyna, to incoming hopefuls Adam Edge Copeland and Sean "Val Venus" Morley. These were fresh bodies, and even the former WCW wrestlers felt fresh themselves with their WWF molded personae. WWF, if nothing else, felt evolutionary in 1998. The same could not be said for WCW's main event here. Hulk Hogan, Sting, Bret Hart, Lex Luger, Randy Savage, Roddy Piper, The Outsiders, and Ric Flair were all north of 40, or close to it. Only Bill Goldberg at age 31 felt like a revelation in 1998, unless you count Sting's ongoing homage to Brandon Lee that at least refreshed him from his enthusiastic, entirely 1980s surfer guise. WCW did have a promising wave of future main eventers, including Goldberg, Booker T, and Diamond Dallas Page, who may have been 42 but wrestled like he was 25. The problem was, nobody in the main event scene was going anywhere. Though Flair would be suspended due to an ultimately pointless row with Bischoff, and Hall would be in and out with personal issues. And worse, nobody that was perceived as a cruiserweight was going anywhere either. Chris Jericho reinvented himself, going from white meat babyface to the brash paragon of virtue, changing the course of his career for good. But when an apparent feud with world champion Goldberg went by the wayside in the blink of an eye, Jericho considered how green the pastures might just be up in New York. Mysterio lost his mask in an ultimately forgettable tag team match against the Outsiders in early 1999. Saturn and Malenko looked strong in dramatic mid-card feuds with Raven and Jericho respectively in 1998, but their big victories didn't come with much in the way of elevation. Instead, they all bashed their heads against an absurdly low ceiling, with the main event above them continuing to grow stale, even as the rejuvenated, hipper WWF began widening its gap over WCW. However, the greatest injustice seemed to be reserved for Benoit. Often regarded among the finest in-ring technicians on the planet, the Canadian crippler blended unflinching strikes with form-perfect execution of suplexes and throws. In the cartoon world of professional wrestling, he resonated as a very real person, and a large segment of the audience latched onto him, an evolutionary dynamite kid with Bret Hart's earnestness. But despite Benoit's popularity and his highly regarded performances, he was hamstrung. He never won a WCW championship belt on camera until 1999, more than 3.5 years after signing with the promotion. To that point, he was continuously booked to come up short against DDP, Fit Finlay, Booker T, and others in secondary title bouts. Much of the blame for this apparent stunting is placed on Kevin Sullivan. Benoit and Sullivan feuded in 1996 on WCW programming, providing the world with a bewildering Falls Count Anywhere match at that year's Great American Bash. But fiction wove with reality, and lines were blurred when Sullivan's real-life wife Nancy, known on screen as the Valet Woman, began having an affair with Benoit. At first, it was merely a storyline, but soon Chris and Nancy became linked romantically away from the spotlight. In 1997, around the same time the near 50-year-old Sullivan retired from the ring to focus more on booking for the company, he and Nancy divorced. She later became engaged to Benoit, and they married in 2000. Benoit felt that his being held back was directly related to Sullivan wielding booking power as the losses mounted throughout 1998 and into 1999. While Benoit was in his own unique predicament, his peers noted their own general lack of upward mobility. Guerrero later wrote, "Unfortunately, too many people, Bischoff and his pals, felt that our smaller size would prevent us from ever going beyond the middle of the card. Either that, or they were afraid of us. Jericho lost faith in WCW after his Goldberg angle was harshly dropped, saying, "My attitude about the company at that point became the same as when you call a girl 10 times and she never calls you back. You start hoping she'll call, then you get bummed out, then desperate, then you realize that it's time to give up and move on." And move on Jericho did. He fled WCW in the summer of 1999, receiving an entrance fit for a god on Raw is War. His first few months with the WWF may have been rough sailing, but eventually he ascended to a spot on the card that Bischoff apparently never envisioned putting him in. As for his friends still in Atlanta, they weren't going to have to worry about Bischoff any longer. 1 month after Jericho debuted for the competition, Bischoff was sent home from WCW, removed from his post in September of 1999. WCW had fallen from unfathomable heights just 3 years after becoming the gold standard in American wrestling, and the man at the wheel for the rise had his keys taken away amid the dizzying skid. He was replaced by a longtime accountant named Bill Bush who had very little product knowledge. To bolster the creative end, 3 weeks later, WCW signed up the controversial figure who many perceived responsible for WWF's creative paradigm shift, Vince Russo. The line-crossing crash TV formula that WWF was engineering to great returns had plenty of the New Yorker's DNA in it. And WCW, needing a desperate shot in the arm, appeared to have pulled off a veritable coup when they poached Russo and writing partner Ed Ferrara in October of 1999. To fast forward a bit, Russo's stewardship of WCW is looked back on as a monumental failure, a persistent train wreck of galling television and laughable ideas, but credit where it's due, Russo did have at least one redeeming quality. He seemed to want to do right by wrestlers that weren't being used to their potential, while phasing out the incumbent old guard that had nothing new to say. Russo did put his foot in his mouth for comments he made in an interview at the time about not wanting to see Japanese or Mexican wrestling and that it would never get over with the American mainstream. But despite this assertion, he did find use for the men who had spent the previous 3 or 4 years occupying the mid-card. Guerrero joined Mysterio, Conan, and Billy Kidman as the Filthy Animals, a group of disrespectful heels that once left Ric Flair for dead in the Las Vegas desert. Malenko and Saturn, meanwhile, puffed out their chests as part of the Revolution alongside Shane Douglas. Both stables had existed before Russo took over, but received more attention and mic time once he had the book. Benoit was previously in the Revolution when it was a babyface group, but became a single star after a falling out, leading to his former comrades going bad. He wrestled Bret Hart in a tournament final to crown a new champion at November's Mayhem event, recognition that Benoit at least deserved a chance to share the same space as the other top guys. Hart won, but Benoit's push persisted. When the calendar flipped over to 2000, Benoit was the United States champion, feuding with NWO deputy Jeff Jarrett. They were set to face off at the sold-out pay-per-view in January in something akin to a 3 stages of hell match, but Jarrett had to back out due to a concussion sustained the prior week. And he wasn't the only important figure to be taken out of that weekend's activities. Goldberg had a horrific arm injury that put him out of action for a long time, while world champion Bret Hart bowed out with a concussion that proved to be career-ending. Then there's the little story of the shot caller. The Friday of that weekend's show, Russo was out, following his own proposal for an eclectic swerve to fill the world title vacancy. He wanted to have former UFC brute Tank Abbott win the belt in an impromptu battle royal at the pay-per-view. Bush, who at least knew that was a preposterous idea, removed Russo from his position as head writer, but told him he could stay on if he agreed to work within a committee among some veteran bookers. Russo opted to quit. After Russo went home, everything descended into anarchy, mostly because of Russo's replacement, Kevin Sullivan. Especially rankled was Benoit, who had no reason to trust Sullivan given his previous treatment when the Taskmaster had control. Benoit wasn't alone in his distress. A reported 15 to 20 wrestlers were up in arms over Sullivan sidling into Russo's position, and there was a sense of impending mutiny. If Sullivan was in, many wanted out. To try and soothe things over, it was decided to have Benoit defeat Sid Vicious to win the vacant world title on Sunday's card. The office was hoping this would build faith between the two sides, though the booking came with a caveat. Sid would lose with his foot under the bottom rope so that the company could possibly renege on the finish later, depending on what happened in the aftermath. But belt or no belt, Benoit still wanted to leave. When Guerrero arrived at Nitro the next day in Columbus, Ohio, he was approached by Benoit and Malenko, who said that they were going to ask for their releases. Guerrero, having been unhappy with the company for some 2 years, was sticking by his friends. Out of all the disgruntled parties, several WCW performers, including the 4 subjects of this video, went to Bill Busch to ask for their releases. Later in the day, Busch told the entourage that they were all being sent home from the tapings, except for champion Benoit, as there were plans for him on Nitro. Benoit told Busch that if his friends were going home, then so was he. And according to Guerrero, Benoit did offer to drop the belt that night to anyone before heading out, but Busch just told him to go. With that, Benoit left the title with referee Nick Patrick and made his exit. The following week, the men who wanted out were actually sent unconditional releases by Busch, meaning they could sign anywhere immediately, including the WWF, which was by now regularly beating the dead horse that was their competition. So why were the releases unconditional? Well, there was a potential legal issue at hand. According to Guerrero's memoirs, one of WCW's road agents threatened to slice their throats when they asked out of the company. Eddie perceived the alarming remark to just be angry talk, but the group leveraged it, contacting the company's human resources department. As Guerrero wrote, their ultimatum was either take out the no-compete stipulation or we'll sue, citing the apparent death threat. In a 2003 shoot interview, Saturn name-drops former wrestler-turned-agent Mike Graham, a close confidant of Sullivan's, going as far as to say that Graham pulled a knife on them. To quell this issue, the releases were made unconditional, and the 4 men signed their names, leaving WCW behind, which brings us right back to the beginning. A week later, while WCW continued its painful contortion among uncertain times, Benoit, Guerrero, Malenko, and Saturn gatecrashed the ring on Raw is War, looking like megastars as they dismantled the New Age Outlaws. Later, Mick Foley asked the foursome how it felt to actually see people in the audience. A beaming, grinning Saturn stated the obvious on camera when he turned and said, "I haven't had fun in a long time."